What opening should I play? That is quite possibly the most common question in chess, especially amongst beginners, because there's no way around it. The world of opening theory is vast, and there are many choices you have to make. But today I will be attempting to answer this question by going through the most common and popular 21 opening systems. Now, I do want to mention that I will be speed running through this. I'm going to be blitzing through all of the openings because this is just to get you an understanding of the various different options that both sides have, the popular choices. This is not going to be a deep analysis of each one. I do have some masterclasses that do provide very deep analysis of each one, but this is sort of just to introduce you to all of the variations and possibilities that both players have. If you think I missed any common openings, then let me know down below. You're watching the Chess Geek channel, and without further ado, let's jump straight in. Now, the opening world definitely revolves around three key principles that you want to achieve in the opening. You want to control the center, you want to develop your pieces, and ultimately castle your king in order to reach king safety. And what you're going to see is the commonality between all of these popular openings are these three exact principles. In fact, the first two most popular moves for white are either e4 or d4. Very logical, controlling the center. And what we're going to be looking at is within these two common moves, what are the common replies? So beginning with e4, there are a couple of replies for black. One of the options that black has is to play the Sicilian, which is to play c5 here. Their idea is to combat the center with the side pawn. Now this gets into some very theoretical variations. White can play the closed Sicilian, which means they are not pushing for d4, or they can play the open Sicilian, where they play knight f3 and they are trying to launch their pawn forward with d4. And within these variations, there are a lot of other side options. For example, in this very normal and natural development for both sides, black already has a couple of options. They can play the Najdorf with a6, they can play the Sicilian Dragon with g6. I made a masterclass, by the way, on the Sicilian Dragon if you're interested for a very in-depth review of this opening. But there are various other options. They can play e6, e5, and because of the vast amount of choices that black has, I would not recommend studying this really with either side. I think this is a very complex opening, and the positions that arise on the board are incredibly theoretical. And so instead of the Sicilian, I think we should move on to an option that is perhaps a bit more common and lends a bit easier to beginners. And that is, without a doubt, the Caro Kann. I also made a masterclass on this one, by the way. The point for black is simple. They are trying to combat the center by playing d5 in the next move. And so after we go d4 to take control of the center, black goes d5, and once again there are many options. For example, the fantasy, or the advanced, or taking, but all of these options are a lot more peaceful in nature. There's not going to be really variations where either side wins in just 5, 10, 15 moves. These are a lot more positional, calm positions, and therefore, I think as a beginner, these variations are a lot more easier to wrap your head around. Now, instead of the Caro, there is a very similar option, the French, which is going e6. Black is going for a very similar idea. They want to defend and prepare the breakthrough with d5. However, by doing it with the center pawn, their idea is to leave open the possibility of using the c pawn for a more aggressive intentions with the move c5. For example, after d4, they're going to launch in the center, and if we push, well, black has a little less space in the center, but they're going to fight back with c5. This is another great option, the French defense, which is, again, as a reminder, the move e6 against e4. Now, aside from the French, there are just a handful other options which are not the move e5, which is by far the most common, so I quickly want to touch on those. One of them is knight to f6. This is known as the Alekhine's variation. Again, not one that I would recommend to beginners because this knight is very vulnerable, and after e5, the knight is kicked around, and it likely will be kicked again with c4, and white ends up getting a lot of space in the center, and it's a very tricky position to fight with the black pieces. It's possible, it's common, but against beginners, I think you're going to have a better choice playing some other variations. I think the Alekhine does not lend itself so useful against beginners. Now, the final variation that black has except e5 is to go d5, the Scandinavian, and this is a fine option as well. The point is that after takes, yes, the queen is coming out to a very vulnerable square, but once it's attacked, it is simply going to slide back to safety, and once it does that, well, black has some very peaceful and natural development. They're just going to go e6, they're going to develop both of their pieces, and both players have a lot of space, a lot of open squares to try to occupy, and it becomes a completely fine battle for either side. So Scandinavian, totally a legitimate system that you can try. And we've made it now across all of the kind of random moves, right? So we looked at c5, we looked at d5, we looked at c6, e6, we looked at knight f6. Now we have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the move e5. Now, e5 is by far the most common variation against e4. They're simply playing symmetrically. Now, against e5, there are a couple of options. Knight f6 is the most natural. You're attacking the pawn, and they have to now defend it, and knight to c6 makes the most amount of sense. Now, in this variation, there are three options for white. The first is the Ruy Lopez, which bishop b5, and this is incredibly common at the top level, but not an opening I would really recommend for white at a lower level, because black, at their choosing, can choose to expand greatly at some point on the queen side, and that can get very uncomfortable to have to fight and battle the space that black is now gaining and obtaining on the queen side. And so I think an option that is a bit more easy and natural for beginners is this move bishop c4. This is known as the Italian, and the point is white is still trying to develop their pieces, they're still aiming at some targets, but you're not giving black the opportunity to expand so easily on the queen side and attack your bishop, and therefore this tends to be a bit more peaceful for white. You don't have to be as sharp in these sort of positions. The most common continuation is bishop c5, after which you have a number of options. You can castle, follow that up with d3, develop this bishop, develop the knight, supernatural moves. It's a very easy position. It's one that plays itself. And the final option in this variation is to go d4. This is known as the Scotch. I think this is another great option that white has. The point is, after black takes, we're going to capture back. And if they take again, well, we get a position where it's really open. And that means that both players can just develop their pieces quite naturally, but especially white here. You can see this bishop comes to c4, this bishop can come to f4, for example, this knight can develop. There's no issues in this position, and therefore I think as a beginner, you're going to find yourself playing these positions quite easily and effectively. And so going back, they don't have to trade, of course. They can develop their bishop and attack the knight, but you simply defend it. They attack it again, and you defend it. You can see that there's a clear strategy going on. They attack the knight, you defend. And therefore, because the strategy of the position is so clear, it's not very difficult to understand the moves. And I think that makes this opening a huge and very effective option for you to consider. Now, the final option that we have in e4 is after e4, e5, not going knight f3, but going knight to c3. And this move, knight c3, comes with the idea of delaying this knight coming to f3 in order to break quickly with f4. Gotham chess, Levi Rosman, is very well known for popularizing this system, where you're essentially quickly going f4. If they take, you continue expanding with e5. They have to retreat now. You then develop the knight. So there's a couple of nice positions that can arise from the Vienna that are just very easy for white to play, and this is another option that you have with the white pieces. We are quickly moving on to d4, which is the other move that white has instead of e4. Now, against d4, there are many options again, and once again, I won't start with the common and natural d5. I'll look at some of the odd moves first. There's the Dutch, which is f5. Not very common. I don't recommend you play this, and I doubt that you'll see this a lot because although, yes, you're gaining space, you're greatly weakening your king, and these light squares are a huge concession, and beginners might not know how to play these sort of variations effectively and minimize the effect of these weaknesses, and therefore, I don't think that this is a great option for you. Instead, there is this move, knight f6. Now, the idea with knight f6 is very natural. You're stopping the immediate e4, which would give white space. So white will often continue by going c4, getting space on the other side of the board. Here, you go g6, you fianchetto the bishop, we continue with knight c3, and here there's a couple of options. There is the Grünfeld, a great option here for black, which is the move d5, and after takes, yes, white gains space if they want with e4, but the resulting position is a very interesting one. This is now introducing the philosophy of modern openings, which is essentially you give your opponent a lot of space with the black pieces, but you're going to fight for this space. So bishop g7, and you're going to make white's position as hard as possible to maintain. They have now this great space in the center, but we're going to slowly attack it from the sides and make it again very difficult to maintain that extra piece and pawns in the center. Now, instead of the Grünfeld, you can also go for the King's Indian, which is not d5, but bishop g7 here. And this is a slightly more difficult opening to play, I would say, especially for beginners, because you do give white space, and it's not as easy to fight for that. In fact, a lot of times white does end up having a space advantage. For example, d6, white can continue by developing the bishops, by developing the knights. There's the Samish, there's the Makhganov with h3. There's a lot of options, but ultimately black often goes e5, allows d5, and white does have a healthy space advantage. So it's not such an easy position to play with the black side. Now, finally, after c4, black can also go e6 and go into the Nimzo. I made another masterclass on this opening, so if you'd like to study this one, I'd recommend you check that out. Black is basically going for this system where they fianchetto the other light square bishop. They're eventually going to fight and try to expand with d5, and they're just developing very naturally. Now, finally, in this move, knight to f6, white can also go bishop to g5. This is known as the Trompowsky, and this I don't really recommend because it gets very tactical after knight e4. There's this variation h4. You can also go bishop f4, and both of these come with some certain risks for white, and I think that generally speaking, they're not very easy positions to play. And aside from this, that really covers knight f6. But black has a lot of other options. So f5 we looked at knight f6. They can play c5. This is known as the Benoni variation. White continues often by expanding, then they develop their knight. We go c4, and here there's two ways to play. One is to just keep the position as is. Black is basically going to develop with d6, and then develop with g6, and try to fianchetto the bishop. And well, this is a completely fine position for both players. Often white grabs some space with f4 and tries to expand on the center of the board. Black tries to expand on the queen side. The other option, though, is the Benko, and the Benko happens after b5. You give away a pawn, and after a6, you give away another pawn, but the point is that by sacrificing some of these pawns, you've opened up the A and B file, and black's philosophy is getting both of the rooks to that file and taking advantage of this open space. And I actually don't recommend as a beginner to take these pawns because material carries a lot less value when you're a beginner, and the attack here is really difficult to defend from. You have to be really precise, and it's very easy as black. The attack really plays itself. Now, aside from this, we're moving on now to the main variations, which is the move d5. We go c4, and here black has a couple of options. They can take. This is known as the Queen's Gambit, and if they take, it's the Queen's Gambit accepted. This is not so popular anymore, and there's a couple of tries that white has. At some point, you can regain the pawn with queen a4 check and taking on c4. You can try the immediate e4, although this gets quite tactical after e5. You can go for e3 here. You can go for knight f3, play a bit more solidly, and later aim to regain back the pawn with the bishop. But black usually won't take, and they'll instead play the Queen's Gambit declined, which is e6, simply defending the pawn. Now we're going to continue here by simply developing, they're going to develop, we develop, and this is sort of a position where both players are getting their pieces out to dominant squares. There isn't really a clear objective for either side, aside from just developing naturally. So this is a completely fine position if you'd like to explore this one. The Queen's Gambit declined for both sides is completely playable. Moving on, we are now looking at the Slav, which is c6. Now, the move c6 essentially aims to again defend the pawn, but there are some downsides. The pro is that black is very solid here. This is a very solid structure. It's not one that is easy to take advantage of. The downside is that black lacks some space. They're taking away some development space and potential for their pieces, and it's a little awkward to develop. Now the final variation against d4 is after d5 not playing c4, but instead developing the bishop. This is known as the London system. It became very popular thanks to Eric Rosen, and essentially white is just going to naturally develop their pieces, play c3, maintain a very solid pawn structure while getting their pieces to active squares. It's a great option for beginners, honestly. I think it will lead to a lot of fun positions. I know a lot of people don't like the London system because it is quite annoying to play against, but well, that makes it a pretty nice and dangerous weapon to utilize. So that basically covers everything with d4 and with e4. The final chunk of this video, I quickly want to mention the other alternatives because it's possible that your opponent will play, for example, c4 or maybe knight f3, but if they don't go for the immediate e4 or d4, they're either playing a move that comes with a lot of dubious downsides, you know, for example, b4 here, they're not fighting for the center, this is not a great move objectively, or by playing c4, they're essentially going to eventually transpose into one of the variations we've already seen. Notice that with d4, often we get the pawn to c4 anyways. So you can certainly imagine that we're going to transpose into a variation that we've already seen. In fact, you know, if you remind yourself, this is the Grünfeld, or this is the King's Indian. So there's a lot of variations that transpose after c4. And a similar thing for knight f3. If you remind yourself, the knight often comes to f3 in many of the variations in the e4 lines, often also in the d4 lines. So again, you're going to have these positions transpose and come to more familiar territory likely. And that's basically it, ladies and gentlemen. I know it was a lot to digest, and I'd recommend, if you'd like, watch this video again, comment any questions you have or clarification questions down below. I'd love to help you on your journey towards choosing an opening and eventually utilizing it effectively. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that it did lead to you getting a better understanding of the very vast opening theory that exists in chess. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.